for Asian American children and families. CACF is the nation's only Pan-Asian children's policy organization, bringing together community-based organizations, young people, and community allies to fight for equity for Asian Americans. Our work is focused on systems change to transform our communities for the better. And on behalf of myself and Vanessa Leung, co-ED of CACF, we welcome you all and thank you for joining us for what we know will be an informative and productive presentation and dialogue on myth-busting, what the AAPI community should know about mass incarceration and New York State bail reform laws. At CACF, we believe that it is only through building knowledge and accurate understanding that we can most effectively advocate for the solutions that address the challenges our AAPI communities face, that we face now and that we have faced for many years. For far too long, myths of our diverse community as a monolith and stereotypes of AAPI communities as a model minority have created barriers to addressing our real needs and racial injustices that we face. But also, and very importantly, these myths and stereotypes have created wedges and misunderstandings, both within our diverse AAPI community and also between our community and other communities of color. We look forward to learning this afternoon about some of the important contexts that we must understand in order to address issues around justice that are so critical for us, especially today with the rise that we see in anti-Asian hate and violence. To be certain, many within our AAPI community have been working for years to address issues around justice, to challenge anti-Blackness, and to build solidarity across communities of color that could result in the most effective solutions for community health, safety, and well-being. CACF is planning to coordinate future dialogues to better understand that work, so stay tuned. We are so grateful today to our presenter, Insha Rahman, Vice President for Advocacy and Partnerships at the Vera Institute for Justice, and to our new CACF board member, Angela Tolosa, for spearheading and moderating this important presentation. Angela currently works at John Jay College of Criminal Justice as an instructor in the sociology department and also consults in the implementation of evidence-based behavioral health programs to support children and families navigating the child welfare system. Angela has worked along several points of the criminal legal system in New York City, including with youth. She earned her JD from Brooklyn Law School. It is my pleasure now to turn the presentation over to Angela Tolosa.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for the warm welcome, Anita. It's really helpful to hear the history and the hard work that has been going on here at CACF over such a long period of time, and also to bring in new partners and like-minded experts to the table. You know, I'm really grateful to have this conversation with all of you, and also very grateful to introduce friend and colleague Insha Rahman to the community here at CACF. So I want to go in to introduce her, correct? So Insha Rahman, I've had the sort of pleasure intersecting with Insha when I worked at New York City Criminal Justice Agency on bail reform work. And so Insha is, you know, one of the states and also one of our national leaders on bail reform across the country. She's Vice President for Advocacy and Partnerships at Vera Institute of Justice, nationally recognized expert on bail, and has developed legislation on bail, including the reforms in New York State. And in addition to sort of overseeing the advocacy priorities of Vera, she's incubated work on reforming prosecution, part of the Blue Ribbon Commission that is closing and working to close Rikers, and has supervised initiatives from Vera at California, Louisiana, and New York. She is definitely our go-to person on expert on bail, not only in our community, but also as held by the Times, NPR, and PBS. Prior to being at Vera, she was a public defender at the Fierce Agency of Bronx Defenders, and she earned her JD from CUNY Law School. So thank you again, Insha, for joining us today.
You would think after 2 years of a pandemic and using Zoom all the time, it'd be quicker to unmute myself. But it's great to be here with everybody. As Anita and Angela said, I'm Insha Rahman, and I really am so glad to be having this conversation with all of you who are joining us, both to have a conversation sort of personally as people of color, as people from the Asian American and Pacific Islander community, and then people who care deeply about justice and safety and fairness and making sure our communities have what we need. So how we're going to spend our time today is I will share out some thoughts about bail reform here in New York, which we know has just been an issue that some of you have championed and know a lot about. Some of you have concerns about and perhaps skepticism. And then some of you maybe just don't know a lot about it other than what we're seeing in the headlines. And there's a lot going on in the headlines. And so what this conversation is intended to do is to be the first of, I know, several conversations that CACF is hosting around justice, public safety, and what our communities need to thrive. And this one will focus specifically on mass incarceration, criminal justice, and bail reform, because it is the criminal justice issue that's front and center here in New York City and across New York State right now. So I will be sharing my screen and going through a PowerPoint for about the next half an hour or so. And I apologize in advance for this sort of presentation format, but I want to make sure that some basic sort of facts and information about bail and bail reform get out to this community, because you all are influential in having these conversations with others in your families, in your communities, in other spaces in your life. And I think the more myth busting we can do and the more access to good information and good ideas and good solutions we can have together, the more we're actually going to do what we all want, which is to make sure that our communities are safe. So with that, before I actually start sharing my screen, and one more thing I should say is, feel free to jump in the chat and drop a question. We'll be monitoring the chat and we'll sort of pull in the question as I'm talking and presenting, so feel free, or just hold your questions and we'll have lots of time for Q&A, because as Anita said, this is really a conversation discussion space, and really for us to share thoughts, ideas, challenges together. So before I actually sort of put up a PowerPoint, start sharing information and numbers and statistics and things like that, I wanted to start on a personal note. So I came to this country when I was 14 years old. I was born in India. My family is not only South Asian, but also Muslim. And, you know, I was brought here and my family, you know, raised me here with this just belief that if you kept your head down and you did what you're supposed to do, that you know, this country would sort of reward you with the things that you deserve, that we all deserve. And so I never really thought very much about structural violence, about the way institutions are not set up to see us, and specifically immigrant communities, succeed, and what it actually means to think structurally about investments and in our communities that keep us safe, and also the biases that institutions have against people like me and my family. And what really changed my sort of narrow view was 9/11. I was in college at the time and saw two of my own cousins basically disappeared by the FBI. One of them was held for 3 days, and we still don't really know 20 years later what happened to him for those 3 days, but what we knew is that he was just never quite the same after. And that targeting of my family, of people in my community, of the mosque that my parents go to, knowing that there were you know, folks infiltrating the community and trying to turn members of the community against each other, really undermined for my family our sense of safety. And what it helped us actually understand was that same undermining of our sense of safety is something that's actually been happening in Black communities in this country since time immemorial, and other brown communities as well. And it was the first time that it became personal as well as deeply political for me and my family. And so I just want to share that to say that's what really brings me to this work. As Angela said, I've been working in the criminal legal reform space for over 20 years. I've done direct services. I was a public defender for many years. And then for the past 7 years, I've been at the Vera Institute in a bunch of different roles, including leading our work on bail reform. And one of the things I say all the time that I believe so truly is that we can have justice and we can have public safety. So often it's seen as a zero-sum game, that you can end mass incarceration, but then you won't be safe. Or you can have safety, but the only way to deliver it is more police, more courts, more jails, more prisons. And I'm here to say from my experience and certainly from the research and expertise that we sort of collectively share, we know that there are many ways to deliver safety and there are ways to lift up our communities and to lift up justice and have safety. So I hope that that's just a helpful framing and understanding of like what brings me to this work and what really undergirds my sort of commitment to it. So with that, I'm going to share my screen. And Anita, I can see you. Will you give me a thumbs up if you can see my screen, please? Thank you. So as I said, I'm going to share some slides and share some information. Please jump in the chat if you have questions. And of course, hold your questions, reflections, thoughts for the end and for our discussion as well. So just a few words about the Vera Institute of Justice, which is where I work. We are a 60-year-old organization that has been working to provide research, technical assistance, and policy advocacy to change government institutions that deliver public safety and justice. And so we work on ending mass incarceration and making sure that we are investing in institutions that serve us and deliver safety. So when we think about the need for bail reform in New York and sort of where the conversation is right now, we so often forget to go back to like, why did we need bail reform in the first place? And what is bail? You know, sometimes I think we go right to the sort of issues, but we forget about the fundamentals of the policy that we're talking about. And in this country, since time immemorial, what bail has meant is that for people to be released after an arrest, they have to put down a sum of money. And in New York, what we had before bail reform was upwards of 22,000 people in jails across New York State. Here in New York City, when I was a public defender over a decade ago, there were 15,000 people at Rikers Island. Just to give you a sense of the impact of bail reform, today there's under 6,000 people. And this is after we've seen bail reform take some hits. It still made a huge, huge difference in terms of freedom for everyday New Yorkers. So bail reform is necessary, in my view, to make sure that we are delivering both justice and public safety. The use of money bail itself, there have been many, many, many studies over the years. Basically, the studies have found that requiring money bail before somebody can be released doesn't actually get people back to court, which is one of the purposes of bail. It also actually doesn't have any correlation with public safety, meaning people are no more safe because they paid some money to be released than if they were just released without any money and expected to come back to court. What we've also seen is that the use of money bail has huge racial justice implications in our country. And so what this is a graph of is the jail population in the US broken out by race ethnicity compared to the overall population in the country. And what you can see is white people make up roughly 62% of the overall population in this country, and they make up less than half of the jail population. On the other hand, Black people make up about 13% of the overall population of this country. They are over 1 out of 3 people in jails in this country. And so what we see so clearly is the racially disproportionate impact that the use of money bail, because if people can't pay bail, where they end up is in jail. This is really driven by the use of bail and that it impacts different communities, especially the Black community, disproportionately. And so, it also impacts people who are poor. And this is a statistic from the Federal Reserve that over 40% of Americans would struggle to cover a $400 emergency expense. So when the average bail in this country is $10,000 for a felony case, and that's a statistic from the Federal Bureau of Justice Statistics, you know that most people who are getting arrested simply can't afford that amount. And finally, we also know that the use of jail from research studies shows that jail is actually what's called carcinogenic. And what that phrase means is that it actually has a further criminalizing effect on people. And that actually sounds counterintuitive to a lot of people. You know, you think, well, if we incarcerate somebody, then we take them off the street. That's actually good for public safety. But what we know is that for people who are incarcerated, over 95% of people come back to our communities, either from jail or prison someday. And how destabilizing the fact of using jail or prison, even just for 23 hours, it means person loses their home, they lose their job, they might lose connections with their kids or their family members. And that actually results in further arrest and further involvement in the criminal justice system in the future. So as counterintuitive as it seems, the use of incarceration is actually criminogenic. It's not good for public safety. And what we also know is that people who are incarcerated, who are in jail, actually suffer worse outcomes in their criminal case than somebody who's released. And how much worse? It's about 18% more likely if you're in jail versus if you're released pre-trial to end up being convicted, meaning being found guilty, and to receive a jail or a prison sentence than if you were out and not incarcerated, and therefore have the leverage of being able to work with your lawyer, to prepare your defense, to negotiate with the prosecutor. You basically lose all of that leverage if you're incarcerated and you're desperate, frankly, to take a plea that often would get you out of jail. One of the statistics that kills me every time from my years as a public defender is I would watch people who insisted on their right to go to trial but were in jail and say, I'm not guilty, but I'll spend longer being in jail waiting for my trial if I insist on my innocence than if I take a plea, say I'm guilty, I get to go home. And that's just not a system of justice that I think any of us agree with, but that's the system of justice that money bail ends up delivering. And of course, many of you know the story of Kalief Browder, and I would say that was really one of the main reasons we needed bail reform in New York. Kalief was 16 years old when he was arrested and accused of robbery. He insisted from day one that he didn't do it. He went back and forth to court in the Bronx 31 times. And in that time, he was offered plea deal after plea deal after plea deal that if he pled guilty, he would just literally go home. And he said, no, I didn't do this. I'm not pleading guilty. His family didn't have $3,000, which was his bail. When he was released after 31 court appearances, 3 years, most of that time spent in solitary confinement, the trauma and the harm of being incarcerated was so great, he ended up taking his life not even 2 years after being released at the age of, if I can do the math, 22. Heartbreaking, really, and a real sort of indictment of our system and how much we fail people. So I say that again because I think so often in the bail fight right now, and as we're sort of talking about the controversy, we lose the reasons why we needed bail reform in the first place. I think it's a good grounding to be reminded of the injustice of money bail in terms of race, in terms of impacting people who are poor, in terms of impacting public safety and harming public safety. Those are really important reasons for why we needed bail reform in the first place. And so we got bail reform in New York. Back in 2019, New York passed what was considered at the time nationally the most expansive and ambitious bail reform law, and that it would result in the most number of people released from jail without having to pay bail. And so what exactly did New York's 2019 bail reform law do? Essentially 5 things to sort of big changes in the law. One was for the vast majority of people who were arrested, about 70% of all arrests, if you're charged with a misdemeanor or a very low-level felony, you would get what's called an appearance ticket. It's basically a ticket that you get saying, we're not going to bring you in to see the judge. We're not going to put you in custody for 24 hours. You just get to go home after the arrest and you come back to court on another date. And so that saves people from 24 hours of in police custody, not knowing where their kids are, not knowing if they'll go to work tomorrow. Instead, it's you get arrested for, say, drug possession or driving with a suspended license or trespass, and you actually get a ticket. You just get to go home. That was a huge change from the law before. The second is that judges can no longer set bail on the vast majority of cases that are misdemeanors and nonviolent felonies. Mind you, the bail reform law didn't change anything for serious cases, for violent cases that are considered violent felony offenses under New York law. Judges have always been able to set bail on those cases and incarcerate somebody. After bail reform, they still can do so. The third important change in the original law was what I call parsimony in the conditions imposed on release. And what that means is that judges couldn't willy-nilly, if you're charged with a theft case, say you have to do drug treatment and mental health treatment, and you have to do this, that, and the other thing. They can only impose those conditions if they're actually necessary to get you to return to court. Likewise, electronic monitoring, which is something we've seen a lot of across the country. It's something we use a lot less in New York, and under the new law, judges could only impose, that kind of limitation on your freedom in serious cases and only for a limited period of time. Risk assessments, I won't touch them, but they are a big controversy in and of themselves. But New York's bail law actually said you can use risk assessment instruments during the pretrial decision-making, but it's got to be done in a very careful, limited way. And the fifth thing, as I mentioned, the law left in money bail for serious offenses, for violent offenses. But what it did require judges to do that they weren't doing before was to consider a person's ability to pay, and to consider more affordable forms of bail that are easier to pay than putting down the full money or going to a bail bondsman to put down the 10% that for most people, they can't even afford that 10%, let alone the whole amount. So that's what the law did. And the impact was tremendous. So I said earlier on, before bail reform happened, we had over 22,000 people in jail across New York State, over 10,000 people here in New York City alone. And what we saw was a tremendous drop in the jail population. And so by just even, a couple of months into when bail reform went into effect, which was the beginning of 2020, we literally saw the jail population statewide drop from a little over 20,000 to 11,500 people behind bars. That's a tremendous drop. And that's really, there's been nothing in this country that has resulted in that kind of rollback of mass incarceration, sort of like in one fell swoop. And so this is why the law was seen as really ambitious and seen as a really important step forward for freedom and for justice. It's also why it caught a lot of flack and a lot of pushback immediately from opponents who include law enforcement, police chiefs, police unions, as well as prosecutors and a lot of elected officials who wanted to weaponize this issue of we're letting people out from jail, we're going to see blood on the streets. And indeed, the law went into effect formally after it was passed in April 2019. It went into effect in January 2020. And we saw instantaneously, sort of the law being blasted as dangerous to communities, doesn't make common sense, it's going to harm all of us. This is a picture of a young woman, Tiffany Harris, who kept getting arrested because she had serious mental illness and was attacking Hasidic women on the street. And the bail law was being blamed for why she was being released, as opposed to blaming the fact that she was seriously mentally ill and had never gotten treatment for her mental illness in a way that would keep her from attacking people again and again. So this is just one example of why the backlash came. And we saw sort of in the news, individual cases being used to say, this law is bad for public safety. We really need to change it and to undo it. And then what we also saw is there are so many different, research reports and news reports that look to examine and say, what exactly is the new law? What's its impact on public safety? Is it actually driving up crime? And I'll point you to, there's a bunch of different, reports that I put on here, but one I'll point you to is on the right side of the screen. You can see from the New York Post, there was an article in July 2020 that said, NYPD's own stats debunk claims of bail reform leading to a spike in gun violence. And we saw at the time, Police Commissioner Dermot Shea repeatedly say in the news, bail reform is bad for public safety. It's what's driving the increase in shootings and homicides that we're seeing. And it turns out the New York Post did a study of 11,000 people who were released because of bail reform from Rikers Island. And less than 1% of those folks had actually been arrested in the future for a gun-related crime. And of that, less than 1%, literally half were arrested as victims of gun violence, not as perpetrators. So it really shows you how scant the connection between bail reform and the increase in shootings and homicides is, but it certainly was the scapegoat and being used as the being blamed as the cause for it. And one thing you might know is that in 2020, as the pandemic hit, what we saw was a tremendous increase in violence and in shootings across the country, not just in New York or New York City, including in many states that hadn't done any kind of criminal justice reform and certainly not bail reform. But since we had just made that change to the law, it was a huge change to the law. We saw a really dramatic impact in the jail population. And then we did see an increase in shootings and homicides and violence, all of which is very real and very concerning to every single one of us. The two didn't actually correlate, but they certainly got put together in the public imagination and got weaponized by opponents of the bail law to say, this is undermining our safety. And so what did we see is literally within months of the law going into effect, the legislature in Albany rolled back some provisions of the law. And here's exactly what they did. So before, if a person was arrested for a low-level offense and picked up a second arrest, a third arrest, they would still be released under the law that passed in 2019. What the changes in 2020 did was allowed for judges to set bail on repeat cases that involve harm to a person or property. They also made more charges eligible for bail. They also, for people who are on parole or probation, made it possible for judges to set bail on them, even if the charges are low level. And, I talked about that sort of parsimony and conditions of release. The rollbacks expanded judicial discretion to impose more programming, treatment, things like that. Now, you would think that that would have ended the backlash because there were changes to the law and they were the kinds of changes that people were calling for to say, we don't want people who keep getting arrested just being let out onto the street. That's exactly what the 2020 changes addressed. And yet we saw that crime is still going up. And this is an article from late in 2021, where it's very clear that America is having a violence wave of assaults are up, shootings are up, homicides are up. Interestingly enough, some other measures of public safety like theft is not up, but the kinds of offenses and incidents that actually make us feel unsafe, violent ones, that's definitely a trend that we saw. And even though we changed some things in the bail law, we still saw gun violence, shootings, assaults keep going up in New York City, across New York State. And of course, that led to what we just saw last month in Albany, which was more changes to the bail law. And so, what was this driven by? I would say it's certainly not driven by policy or research or evidence about the bail law and what works and what doesn't work. It was driven entirely by the politics. And so Mayor Eric Adams came into office at the beginning of this year, and on his campaign, he made it very clear we need public safety, and he is the person to deliver it. And one of his targets was the bail law, and he keeps saying that bail reform is making us unsafe. He has no evidence, no basis for it. That New York Post article about the 11,000 people and less than 1% are involved in any kind of gun violence, that still holds true, except for it's a very powerful talking point, especially at a moment when people aren't feeling safe and they aren't seeing any other solutions being offered. So of course they will latch on to, yep, it's the bail law that's making us unsafe. And what we saw is really public opinion for bail reform, which was actually very high in 2019, dropped dramatically. And so here's a piece from a poll from Siena College, who are, one of the main pollsters in New York. And back in 2019, support for the bail reform law was at close to 60%. That dropped to less than 30% by late February 2022. Like, that's how much public support for a very good, and I would say common sense change to the law had dropped because of the relentless media coverage and the false connection between bail reform and a lack of public safety. And we saw awful incidents, like many of you heard of a woman who is a scientist who was riding the subway home from work and was attacked by a man carrying a hammer. Terrible, terrible incident. Didn't have anything to do with bail reform. And somehow she became a spokesperson in the New York Post for wanting lenient bail reform to be undone. So again, it's sort of weaponizing these outlier but really horrific attacks on people to say bail reform is what's to blame. And so the right solution is to change it and to roll it back. And so what we saw again just last month in Albany was some more changes to the bail law. And let me take a moment to explain what they are. So what the bail law did was basically, what the changes to the bail law did was basically respond to what we're seeing as the sort of the biggest issues that are coming up in Albany in terms of the political climate. One is guns and gun violence. Truly, gun violence has gone up. In New York, it's gone up everywhere across the country, less so in New York than other places, but still is a very, very real and live issue for many communities across the state. And so the changes to the bail law that just happened in Albany lowered the number of guns required to meet the threshold for trafficking. So it basically means gun traffickers can be prosecuted more easily. It also allows judges to consider whether the offense somebody is charged with, that are there allegations of them causing serious harm to somebody, and factor that into setting bail or releasing someone. It's also expanded the police's discretion to take somebody into custody and have them go see a judge instead of giving them an appearance ticket. And importantly, and this is one incident that I know every single one of us who lives in New York City heard of, and I'm sure thinks of every time we're on the subway, but the death of Miss Go at the hands of a very mentally ill man who pushed her into the subway led to a real call to do more in terms of Kendra's law, which judges can force people to engage in mental health treatment. And so one of the changes to the bail law was to actually expand judicial discretion to require people to get mental health assessments. So those are the overall changes that we've seen. And I bet if you are not sort of deep into the weeds of this, you're thinking, well, what's left of the bail law? Do we still have bail reform, or has it all been rolled back after the changes in 2020, and the changes again in 2022? And the answer is yes, we still have bail reform. It still has a lot of impact. There are many, many more people free today in New York State, even after 2 rounds of rollbacks, than what we had before bail reform was passed. And I say that very clearly because I want folks to know, if you care about bail reform, if you care about how we do justice and public safety, we have a big fight still on our hands in New York State to protect what we have remaining of bail reform and to make sure we don't roll ourselves back to the days of Khalif Browder, where people remained in jail simply because they didn't have the money to pay for their freedom. And so what is the impact as we sit here today of the bail reform? What we know from the data from when the law went into effect in January of 2020, 18 months out through 2021. So what we know is of about 100,000 people released because of New York's new bail laws, only 2% were rearrested for a serious offense. And by serious offense, I mean an offense that involves violence, a gun, a robbery, a knife, anything that would have us really be concerned about our physical safety. 2% of people who are released are rearrested. And those statistics for New York's bail reform and the impact, it's consistent with what we've seen in other places that have done bail reform, like New Jersey, our neighbor that implemented bail reform in 2017. They have basically the exact same number. So it means New York's bail law isn't doing any worse than anywhere else that's done bail reform. We just hear about it a lot because it's been politicized and weaponized in a way that we haven't seen anywhere else. And then of those, that 2% who are arrested for a violent felony, a serious offense when released pretrial, only 429 were involving a firearm. And I say only, and then I kind of want to take it back because 429 is 429 gun cases too many. I think many of us would really love to see tighter gun control. But the point is, bail reform wasn't responsible for that. Our, national sort of approach to gun violence and gun ownership is really the challenge there, not bail reform. And then what we also know, and I think this is a staggering statistic, is that because of bail reform, 80,000 New Yorkers avoided jail as a result of the law. And that's 80,000 New Yorkers who in 18 months would have had money bail set. The vast majority couldn't pay that bail. They would have probably pled guilty. And that would have come at tremendous cost to taxpayer dollars. In New York City, it costs close to $500 per night to incarcerate somebody. In the rest of the state, it's cheaper, but still upwards of $80 a night. And also the cost to families, to employers, to communities really just can't be understated. So that is a tremendous number. And when we are arguing with folks about the impact of bail and what has it done that's good for our communities, those 80,000 New Yorkers who were saved from a day of jail, has to come front and center. And then what we also know is that bail reform did not negatively impact public safety. So the two measures that I said that we look at when we talk about bail reform, is it working, is do people show up to court? And what about pretrial rearrest? People get rearrested while they're out. And if we look at the numbers pre-bail reform and post-bail reform, the numbers are basically identical in terms of people coming back to court and people getting rearrested pre-trial. So bail reform didn't change anything about people sort of pre-trial, what we call success. Now, here's the thing is you can hear all of these numbers and say, okay, I hear you on the data that it looks like bail reform is working. I hear you on the fear mongering and the weaponizing of bail reform. But where I sit today, I feel less safe in New York City, or I feel less safe in my New York community, because I do see more disorder on the streets. I see more people who are homeless or are facing housing instability. I see more people who clearly have an unmet and untreated mental health need. And so you can tell me bail reform is working, but I feel less safe. And I don't know, we can talk about how many people feel that way, but I will admit, as a longtime New Yorker, I feel that way. And I'm somebody who's sort of seen the system inside and out. And it's true that things do feel, I think, less safe across New York City. And the question is then, so what are the solutions? Because we all deserve to be safe. And if we blame the wrong cause, like blaming bail reform, we miss the opportunity to find the right solutions. And so before I open it up, and I know there's a bunch of, notes in the chat, I just want to talk for a minute about some of the investments that we have already made statewide in public safety and some of the best solutions we've seen. I can get into more detail in the Q&A if people are interested about how exactly these solutions work. So you have a concrete sense of what can we do short of rolling back bail reform, which actually won't help make us safer. What can we do to invest in public safety in this moment? And so in the budget that passed, in addition to the changes to the bail law, which in my view were unnecessary to shore up public safety, but these investments were necessary. And I'm glad that they happened. And myself and many other advocates pushed hard for this. So first and foremost, gun violence prevention and intervention programs. We want to stop violence before it happens. And putting real money into community violence intervention has been shown to be incredibly effective. In Crown Heights, Brooklyn, a community violence intervention program resulted in 20% fewer shootings than in other neighborhoods next door that didn't have that program. That is a difference that makes a real difference when it comes to public safety. In addition, the budget invested in more pretrial support, which means people can be released, but they get supervision and supports while they're released pretrial, and those programs have been found to be incredibly effective. And then the really big dollar investment in the budget was in mental health crisis infrastructure. And so many of us are going to be pushing for everything from community-based mental health treatment to expanded crisis intervention centers, where if the police or if a person on the street, a good Samaritan, sees somebody who looks like they're in crisis, they don't have to call somebody they don't have to call 911. They can actually call another number and get somebody to a crisis stabilization center. And to do more just community-based support, as well as inpatient mental health treatment and mental health beds, which are woefully insufficient here in New York. So I said, here are the investments that we've made. What are a couple of solutions that we've seen that we all should be pushing for to make sure that our communities are safer? And here are 4 that have demonstrated to be really effective. One, I mentioned violence intervention programs. I mentioned the Crown Heights example. We are going to be doing much more of that across New York State. And for the shootings and the sort of homicides, those really serious offenses that we see, I do think it will have a real impact. It's had before, and we've never invested in it the way that we've invested in, say, policing or prosecution. More investments will help us demonstrate that this works to just prevent shootings and prevent violence before it happens. A second one feels a little bit separate and apart from crime and public safety, but it's actually been demonstrated to be one of the most effective investments in keeping communities safe, which is more after-school programs and job trainings. And we know this, if people are stable, they had good, secure incomes, if they have a roof over their heads, they're a lot less likely to be driven to break the law. And then we know that people are struggling with mental health, with treatment, with stability, and that's only been exacerbated by the pandemic. And so money for supportive housing and treatment for people with mental illness and with substance use disorders is, again, one of the best public safety investments we can make. Many of the high profile, horrific incidents that we've seen, like this girl being pushed onto the subway tracks, like the scientist coming home from work who was beaten with a hammer on the subway. Those are all people with serious untreated mental illness who, if their mental illness was addressed, perhaps those 2 people would be both alive and unhurt today. And then the 4th is something I want to suggest very specifically, because people ask often, well, instead of calling the police, what else can we do? And I want to mention neighborhood community safety roundtables and give an example of one in Newark, which is, again, across the Hudson River in New Jersey. They've had community safety roundtables every week for the past several years. And both crime and violence has gone down significantly in Newark since they started. And during the pandemic, where shootings and homicides went up in virtually every single American city, Newark, they didn't. They actually stayed the same. In fact, they went down a little bit. And what the Newark officials and community leaders attribute it to is the Community Safety Roundtable, where police and community leaders meet every single week. I've attended these meetings. It's over 50, 60 people every week, and they problem solve together. Hey, we saw a bunch of incidents in this neighborhood. We need to talk about, like, how do we address this? And it's often a community solution, not just a police solution. And that's something that I want to share, especially for our Asian American Pacific Islander communities, when we are concerned about just having more police responses and not being sure, like I feel unsure that that will necessarily make us safer. There are other ways to get to safety that require community collaboration, which is clearly something that's important to all of you because you're here today and doing this work day in and day out. So I'll stop there. I will stop sharing my screen. And I will turn to the chat, but before I do, Angela, I wanted to turn it back to you to raise if there's any questions or any points that you want to pick up on, and then we can open it up to everybody for discussion.